2 men, 2 cults, over 1,000 dead. They claimed to lead their followers to salvation. Instead, they led them to mass suicide and fire. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a warning. How far would you go for someone you believe is chosen by God? In the United States, a land built on the promise of religious freedom, belief can sometimes turn into obsession, and when that obsession is led by a single voice, unquestioned, absolute, it can become fatal. 2 men, 2 different paths, yet both ended in mass death. Their names are forever tied to 2 of the deadliest cult tragedies in American history, Jim Jones and David Koresh. Each claimed to speak for God, each led followers with promises of salvation, and each ended up taking lives by the dozens, by the hundreds. Jim Jones began as a charismatic preacher in Indiana during the 1950s. He spoke about racial equality, social justice, and building a better world. He attracted hundreds, then thousands, but the more people followed, the more power he demanded. By the mid-1970s, he moved his congregation, the People's Temple, to the jungles of Guyana in South America. There, far from the eyes of U.S. law, he created Jonestown, a supposed utopia. But in November 1978, over 900 people died in Jonestown. Men, women, and children were found lying side by side, poisoned by cyanide-laced flavor aid. Jones called it revolutionary suicide, but many were forced, some were injected, others were shot. It was, at the time, the largest single loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster. David Koresh came a decade later. His real name was Vernon Howell. He emerged in the 1980s as the leader of a fringe Christian group called the Branch Davidians, based outside Waco, Texas. Unlike Jones, Koresh didn't preach socialism. He preached apocalypse. He believed he was the final prophet, the Lamb, who would open the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation. He claimed exclusive access to divine truth. He stockpiled weapons. He took multiple spiritual wives, some as young as 12. In 1993, after months of federal investigation into alleged weapons violations and child abuse, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms attempted to raid the compound. A gunfight broke out. A 51-day standoff followed. Then, on April 19th, the compound caught fire during an FBI assault. 76 people died, including Koresh himself. 2 different scenes, one in the jungle, the other in Texas, but both led by men who used faith as a weapon. Both ended in mass death, and both raised the same haunting question: how does a man gain so much control that people will follow him into the grave? This story isn't just about death, it's about manipulation, control, and how belief, when twisted, can become more dangerous than any gun. In the next part, we'll examine how both leaders operated, their psychological profiles, methods of control, and the paths that turned conviction into catastrophe. Jim Jones and David Koresh didn't start out as murderers. They began as men with visions that, over time, hardened into dogma, then into demands, and finally, into destruction. To understand how they gained such overwhelming control, we need to look beyond their words and into the structures they built, the tactics they used, and the minds they shaped. Jim Jones mastered psychological isolation. He understood that to own a person's loyalty, you had to separate them, not just from their families, but from any competing source of truth. When his movement grew in California, he surrounded himself with people who obeyed without question. Dissenters were publicly humiliated. Followers were encouraged to spy on one another. Emotional dependency became currency. Eventually, he moved his entire congregation to the jungle of Guyana, cutting off all outside communication. There was no media, no law enforcement, no escape. In Jonestown, he became the only voice that mattered. He used fear as fuel. He preached that enemies, CIA agents, the US government, defectors, were everywhere. Drills were staged to test loyalty. Followers were asked to drink colored liquid, told it was poison, then told it was a test. When the real poison came, many had already rehearsed their deaths. David Koresh, on the other hand, didn't isolate his followers by distance, but by doctrine. Inside the Mount Carmel compound, the Bible was no longer a sacred text shared by many. It was a code only he could decode. He taught that the end of the world was imminent, that he alone was chosen to lead God's army, and that obeying him was not just loyalty, it was salvation. To disobey was to betray God himself. He created a rigid hierarchy. Women were assigned as wives to Koresh, regardless of marital status. Children were raised to see him as a father and a prophet. Men were stripped of power, told their spiritual growth depended on full submission. Everyone lived under the constant expectation that the final battle was near, and that when it came, they would either fight for Koresh or die with him. Both men controlled through a mix of prophecy, paranoia, and punishment. Both manipulated sacred ideas for personal dominance, but the key difference was in how they viewed their own roles. Jones, toward the end, grew disillusioned and paranoid. He spoke of death as an escape from betrayal and injustice. Koresh, in contrast, never gave up the mission. He stayed calm, calculated, even while surrounded by tanks. He promised revelation. He wrote sermons. He waited for fire. Their psychological profiles differ in critical ways. Jones showed signs of narcissistic collapse, loss of identity, increased substance abuse, erratic behavior. He took pills, slurred his speech, and often rambled in paranoia. Koresh, however, maintained clarity, focus, and a frightening sense of purpose. Experts suggest he had delusional disorder, wrapped in charismatic control. He didn't lose his grip, he tightened it. Both men exploited vulnerability, loneliness, trauma, the need for belonging. But where Jones preyed on social despair, poverty, racism, political disillusionment, Koresh exploited spiritual confusion. He offered answers to those who felt abandoned by mainstream religion. Both forms of manipulation were effective. Both led to death. To compare the danger posed by Jim Jones and David Koresh, it's not enough to count the dead. Death is only the final act. The real threat lies in everything that came before. The systems they built, the obedience they commanded, the lives they broke long before they ended. But even so, the numbers tell a brutal story. Jonestown claimed 918 lives on a single day, November 18, 1978. Of those, over 300 were children. The victims died from ingesting a mixture of cyanide, Valium, and Flavor Aid. Some were injected forcibly. Others were shot while trying to escape. Only a handful survived by hiding or fleeing into the jungle. It was the largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. The horror of it didn't end with the deaths. It extended to the logistics of recovery. The U.S. military had to airlift hundreds of bloated, decaying bodies back from Guyana. For weeks, the media showed rows of corpses laid out under the tropical sun. It wasn't just a massacre, it was a warning. 15 years later, Waco burned. On April 19, 1993, after 51 days of siege, FBI agents moved to end the standoff with the Branch Davidians. Armored vehicles punched holes in the walls to insert tear gas. Hours later, the compound caught fire. 76 people died, including 25 children, and Koresh himself. Autopsies revealed that some were burned alive, others were shot in what appeared to be mercy killings or suicides. Several had high levels of cyanide in their blood from inhaling smoke produced by the fire. Unlike Jonestown, Waco unfolded live on national television. The country watched in real time as flames consumed the compound. The image of the blackened ruin became a permanent scar on the American psyche. But danger isn't just measured in casualties, it's measured in influence. After Jonestown, many assumed no one would ever follow a figure like Jones again. They were wrong. Koresh proved that fanaticism adapts. He didn't promise social revolution like Jones, he promised divine purpose. He armed his followers, prepared them for siege, and convinced them that death was a gateway, not an end. What's more, Waco had a ripple effect. It became a rallying cry for anti-government extremists. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, cited Waco as one of the reasons he carried out his attack in 1995, killing 168 people. Koresh didn't just lead people to their deaths, he inspired others to kill long after he was gone. Experts in cult behavior draw a key distinction between the two leaders. Jim Jones built his control on isolation and physical distance. His followers were cut off, both emotionally and geographically. David Koresh, by contrast, operated under constant surveillance. The FBI was watching, the press was watching, yet he still held his group together through 2 months of starvation, threats, and negotiations. That level of loyalty, under pressure, is rare and dangerous. From a tactical perspective, Koresh's group was more militarized. The branch Davidians had over 300 firearms, including assault rifles, shotguns, and semi-automatic pistols. Authorities recovered over 1 million rounds of ammunition from the compound. In contrast, Jonestown was lightly armed. Jones relied on psychological control, not firepower. But Jones was faster. He pushed his followers toward mass death in one sweeping move. Koresh played a long game, manipulating federal agents and media narratives for weeks. His was a slow-burn catastrophe, fueled by prophecy and paranoia. Both were lethal, but the danger wasn't just in what they did, it was in what they showed the world. That belief, twisted hard enough, can outlast bullets. That one man, if given enough authority, can make people drink poison or wait in silence for the flames. Years have passed since Jonestown and Waco, but the questions they raised haven't faded. What kind of man convinces people to die for him? What kind of world allows it to happen? And how close are we, any of us, to falling under the spell of someone who claims to have all the answers? What Jim Jones and David Koresh left behind wasn't just a count of the dead. They left behind proof that belief can be shaped into a weapon, that fear and hope can be twisted until they blur into obedience, and that under the right conditions, ordinary people can become part of something that ends in catastrophe. Jones weaponized trust. His followers weren't strangers to suffering. Many were poor, black, or marginalized. He gave them a cause, a purpose, a home. In exchange, he demanded everything: their loyalty, their privacy, their lives. When Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate, Jones panicked. A few defectors tried to leave with the congressman. They were gunned down at the airstrip. Within hours, Jones ordered the mass suicide, calling it an act of protest. It wasn't protest. It was a murder-suicide orchestrated by a man who could no longer control the world outside his own. Koresh, on the other hand, never fled the spotlight. For 51 days, he held out in the Mount Carmel compound, broadcasting messages to the world, insisting he was waiting for a sign from God. He knew the government was coming, he knew death was near, but instead of surrender, he fortified his theology. The fire that consumed the compound didn't start in panic, it started in purpose. and that is perhaps more chilling. What makes their stories especially haunting is how their followers looked, people not unlike you or me, teachers, veterans, nurses, parents. They weren't mindless. They were convinced. Some had doubts. A few tried to leave, but most stayed. Not because they were stupid or evil, but because they believed. They trusted the wrong man, and it cost them everything. The legacy of these two men still casts a shadow. After Jonestown, the term "drinking the Kool-Aid" became shorthand for blind loyalty. But that phrase erases the reality. Many didn't drink by choice. Some were forced, others were too young to understand. At Waco, the images of the burning compound became a symbol for mistrust, of the government, of the media, of power itself. For some, it justified violence. For others, it confirmed that apocalyptic thinking wasn't just a fringe idea, it was a real threat. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's not just to fear cult leaders. It's to recognize the conditions that make them possible. Desperation, loneliness, a hunger for meaning. These are the cracks in a person's armor, and someone like Jones or Koresh knows exactly how to slip through. Even now, new leaders rise with the same patterns: charisma, certainty, a message tailored to the moment. And if we don't pay attention, we risk letting history repeat itself, not with the same names, but with the same silence that allowed these tragedies to unfold. This is not just history, it's a mirror, and every time we look away, we give it another chance to come true again. What happened in Jonestown and Waco wasn't just about faith gone wrong, it was about power, desperation, and the terrifying ease with which belief can be hijacked. Jim Jones and David Koresh are gone, but their playbooks still exist, and if we don't recognize the signs, we might not see the next one coming until it's too late. If this story made you question what loyalty really means, hit the like button, subscribe for more true crime breakdowns, and share your thoughts in the comments.